Well, hey, friends, welcome to AWKNG's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 30. We are excited to be back with Dr. Stovell again as we cover more questions on the books of Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ruth. If you missed the last episode, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that. We hit questions and had really great discussions around the books of Proverbs and Song of Songs. And so this episode, we're going to really focus on the book of Ruth. So Dr. Stovell, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us yet again.
Oh, I'm happy to be with you guys. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to jump straight into the questions so we can have as much time as we can to cover content. So the first question that came in on the book of Ruth says, in the study guide, it was mentioned that Ruth may be a female Job. Is that a valid consideration, and why would scholars argue for that case? So have you ever heard that term, female Job, when it comes to Ruth?
So actually, the book of Ruth, the story overall, yes, but usually they're referring to Naomi as a female Job in the book of Ruth. So Naomi experiences this, complete devastation, the loss of her husband and her sons. And because of that, she loses, her protection and her income and all of her future. And because of that, she much of the book is in a sense like turning to God, protesting, like feeling that injustice. And there are friends who are shocked, and there's also this sense of like she has to try and figure out, based on God's responding, what does she do? She's never really given an answer as to why she lost her husband and her sons, but she has a new path that's given to her. And so I think in those ways it makes sense to see Naomi as a female Job, because there are a lot of parallels. But I'd like to say that there's some ways that it's helpful to compare them in differences. So, in the book of Job, while Job experiences great devastation, we don't get the sense that that devastation necessarily means he's going to die. Whereas in Naomi's situation, her anticipation is that she will die. And the reason for that is because the difference between how a male person experiences this kind of loss in the ancient world versus a woman, both of them experience so much loss. But women in the ancient world, particularly widows, were one of the most vulnerable groups in existence. It's why they're mentioned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy as people that need the care of Israel, because without the protection of their husbands, and in her case also her sons, and without male relatives to protect her, she is left completely vulnerable in a way that could lead to violence against her and to potential death. And so when she speaks to her daughters, her daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, she is telling them to go get married to other people because then they'll be protected. Because with 3 widows, you have the even more possibility that you're going to have just absolute vulnerability and loss. And she can't really see a path forward from that. And so I think that it's important to point out that this actually frames a lot of why the story works the way it does. Why do we need Boaz in the story? Part of the reason that we need that is actually because for Naomi and for Ruth to survive, they need that male relative. We don't have that dynamic in the world today, generally speaking, or at least not in Western settings. We tend to think of women as being able to then, go earn a living, or like if a woman's a widow, she has the possibility of taking care of herself. And if her daughters, who are relatively young, are widows, they still have the possibility of taking care of themselves. In the ancient world, that just really wasn't the way it worked for women, because protection by men was how the systems worked. And so while Naomi has some land, it's sort of hers and sort of not hers. It's really going to be whatever male relative can use that land. And so it creates some of these dynamics that we see throughout the book. And that those dynamics, I would say, are different than what we see in Job. And then the other difference I'd say is that whereas Job is, it's largely poetic.
Mhm.
It has story elements, but most of it is written in poetry. The majority of Ruth is written as a story, it's a narrative. And so that also creates differences in how we would read those two books. And so I just think that's helpful for comparison purposes.
Yeah, that's great.
I think I'm glad you nuanced it out. That it's the when we wrote the study guide, it was talking about the book of Ruth, not the character Ruth herself, and
Mhm.
a lot of
Mhm.
that has to do with some of that scholarship that has kind of noticed, little subtle hints about the book of Ruth itself. Is that like in our Protestant canon, we typically put Ruth alongside with like right before the book of Samuel. Like we're trying to do it in like a chronological sense
Mhm.
versus in the Hebrew Bible, historically it was placed in the writings, like
Mhm.
near the Proverbs, if not like amongst the other wisdom literature. And so there's almost like this hint that's happening that, hey, we just finished reading a whole bunch of wisdom literature. We read Job, we read Psalms, we had Proverbs, Song of Songs. Oh, huh, how should we think about Ruth here in this moment? and
Mhm.
and so
Mhm.
kind of feeds into that mentality, and that was like a little subtle hint that we were trying to highlight with the study guide,
Yeah.
that there is something going on, that this book is meant to not just be about historical fact as how the Protestant canon like to portray it, but this is a story that's supposed to give you a sense about wisdom, but interestingly from the perspective of a woman, Naomi in that
Mhm.
case. And it's also very interesting because I realize Naomi and Ruth, between the two of them, Naomi is the most dynamic one, versus Ruth is, she's great, but she's basically told what to do because she is a Moabite. She
Mhm.
has no idea what this culture is that she has entered
Yeah.
into. She made the declaration amazingly that Yahweh will now be her God, which is already like, how did that occur, that you will actually surrender your allegiance to your Moabite god and now you're worshiping the god of the Israelites? But she does what she's told to do.
Mhm.
And we are not really kind of given any hint about her emotional or inner turmoil or whatever else. But with Naomi, we clearly do. And so I think there's
Absolutely.
there's that little bit of like, yeah, Naomi is like a female Job, but in worse
Mhm.
Mhm.
straits because of her social status amongst society. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
one of the most helpful commentaries that even got me on to this idea was this commentary series called "Finding God in the Margins,"
Mhm.
and it's this one was written by Carolyn Custis James, and
Mhm. Yeah.
the end of her introduction, she simply mentioned how that this book, it will raise the bar for what it means to live in a fallen world as God's child, as his image bearers. It presents a startling vision of the kingdom potency of male
Mhm.
female relationships, and will inject rich hope, purpose, and significance into the veins of most God-forsaken, hollowed out human souls. It was just like,
Mhm.
Mhm.
it's like, oh wow, like that for her,
Mhm.
that this book offered a lot of insight into the necessity of both male and female to work together in a world that is very hard and difficult to live in.
Yeah.
Mm.
It reminds me, there's some amazing work by Jenny Matheny, where she talks about Ruth in relationship to some of the more violent images of what happens to women in Judges.
Yeah.
And one of the things she's in making these comparisons, she's really drawing out the way Ruth pulls us into a space of hope because of her hesed, this idea of like faithful, loyal love. And
Mhm.
so it's absolutely true that Ruth is a listener and a responder to Naomi. But we also see the way that in doing so, Ruth's kind of love mirrors the kind of love we hear about how God loves.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting piece. And she does that in a world where everything is really against her in so many ways, both her and Naomi. And so I find that there's this really hopeful way of placing Judges and Ruth near each other. And I think the power of like Job and Ruth as stories beside each other and Judges and Ruth as stories beside each other can be really profound.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Well, Beth, even the way that you're saying it, like the imagery in my mind is almost like Ruth was almost like a Pollyanna, that like in the midst of like of facing all these insurmountable cultural issues, and yet ironically, because she is a Moabite, she's coming in with almost very innocent eyes of like, I don't know what's going on amongst all of you guys. What is this
Yeah.
under tension between family and whatever else? Oh, and Boaz, I'm going to make sure that you're going to be taken care of, and the men are going to not bother you and whatever else like that. It's such an interesting thing of that she is coming in some sense almost like with a Gentile perspective, and maybe helps us, even us, for us who are Gentile readers, to kind of ease into this world of like, wow, it's so for a functioning society, you do need to find men who actually are willing to do the right thing and
Yeah.
not give in to base
Mhm.
impulses, and the significance that that difference can make for the
Mhm.
lives, especially of the women within that society.
I will say when we
Yeah.
get to our final question for this podcast, that'll come up again. Boaz and base desires. I'm just giving a preview to our listeners
Mhm. Yes,
as
that's
we talk
good.
about uncovering his feet, because
Yeah.
that's actually a key part of the characterization of Boaz, right? So
Mhm.
yeah.
That's great. Okay, well, let me move us along so that we can get to that final question now that all the listeners are probably going to be curious about what that question is, even though some might have figured it out by now. So let me ask you this next one that came on. It says, what is the significance that Elimelech was an Ephrathite? Did I say it right?
Ephrathite, yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
yay.
so
I'm
yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question. Sounds a little vague, but it's actually creates some really interesting things about this. So, if Ephrathah, the where we get Ephrathite from, is an
Mhm.
area. It's the name of the area surrounding Bethlehem, and so saying that he's an Ephrathite is saying he's someone who's from the area near Bethlehem.
Mhm.
And this group of people, some people think that they came from like northern Judah and then settled slightly in more southern Judah. But basically, he's from Judah, which is important. So he's from Judah. Naomi's from Judah. This is crucial to the story because knowing where they're from helps us understand that when they go to Moab, they are going as Israelites, which is essential to the story because the story doesn't make sense if we don't understand that they're Israelites. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it tells us how serious the famine is. So if you're traveling all the way from Bethlehem and that area all the way to Moab, it means that whatever that famine was, it was very serious and it was worth trying to see if they could get provision somewhere else. And so it sets up the story, but it also tells us that this is a pretty intense situation that the people are facing. Connecting the story to Bethlehem, particularly connecting the start of the story of Ruth to Bethlehem, actually connects the beginning of Ruth and the end of Ruth. So the beginning of Ruth sets up Bethlehem and talks about it several times, using Ephrathite as an example and specifically naming Bethlehem. And then the end of Ruth talks about how David is a descendant of Ruth. So David is closely associated with Bethlehem. Second Chronicles 11 talks about David. That is David's birthplace. So part of what it's doing is actually creating bookends of the story by putting Bethlehem at the beginning and David at the end, and showing that the book, while it has meaning as a story internally, it also has meaning because of who comes from, who is the descendant of Ruth from the beginning and the end of the story. So yeah, so it's actually a pretty important detail, even if it seems like a small one.
Yeah, I think I was wondering like if that little mention is going to be directly connected to the end. I sort of remembered about the. I knew that they were coming from the area because that's the whole reason why they even come back and why they encounter a person like
Mhm.
Boaz, because he's from
Yeah.
that family, and thus he's
Mhm.
going to be part of that family genealogical line to David, and then eventually, for us as Christians, it eventually goes all the way to Jesus. And so
Yeah.
like there was that little kind of, it's just kind of cool to kind of see that the authors are thinking very purposely, and they're winking at the audience of like, now if some of you are willing to take the time to try to figure this out, you'll see what I'm
Yeah.
getting at. And sort of like this
You
little
see?
hint and wink.
Yes, exactly. And the thing about Ruth as a story is there is a lot of hinting and winking in the book. Like there's a lot of things that like a set of words are all put together to create a moment or a feeling or a question that are subtle. But the reader of the time would have really seen them. And so part of the work of reading the book of Ruth is seeing those subtle connections. That's why commentaries on Ruth are super helpful, because otherwise sometimes we miss it in our English translation. Yeah.
That's great. Great. Awesome, guys. Okay, let's jump to a quick commercial break, and then we're going to come back and we are going to hit the 2 final questions, with the last one being a little doozy. So we'll be right back. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast.
Do it.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Here we go in 3, 2.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We've got 2 final questions for you. And the first one is out of Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6. The question says, God gives a command that no Moabite can become part of Israel. Yet we see this happen with Ruth at the very end of the book. Did God change his mind, or is there something that I'm missing? So if you wouldn't mind, I don't know if you have Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6 open, but maybe read those to us if you have them, so that our listeners can get some context and then, give us your thoughts. If not, I can try to pull it really quick.
I can get that for you.
Okay.
So 3 to 6 says the following in Deuteronomy 23. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing to you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. So, the question here is twofold. One, how are we reading what Deuteronomy 23 says? And then what happens if we place Deuteronomy 23 in relationship to other parts of Deuteronomy? So I'm going to start by placing Deuteronomy in relationship to passages that come before. So Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 19, has a whole section on how we treat the most vulnerable people. Now, among that list of vulnerable peoples, particularly in verse 18 and 19, we see that God loves the sojourner, and he does this through action. So he tells the people to give food and clothing to the sojourner. So what is a sojourner? Sojourner is a foreigner who is in the midst of the people. So like if someone is a foreigner, but they end up with Israel, they're supposed to give them food and clothing and take care of them. And the reason that's given is a similar reason that's given both in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus for this action, which is Israel were sojourners in Egypt. So they knew what it was like to be in a foreign land as a foreigner, and God gave provision to them. So they're supposed to take care of the sojourners that are amongst them. So basically the idea is, because Israel has experienced what it is to be that foreigner in the midst of another country, and God cared for them, so they should care for foreigners with them, among them. So we get similar language in Deuteronomy 14, 28 to 29, And it uses this language of the orphan, the fatherless, the widow. In our conversation about Ruth just a minute ago, I was talking about how widows are in one of the most vulnerable categories. So these are the kind of main categories of the most vulnerable: widows, because they don't have male protection; fatherless, because, again, they have no father to protect them. And that we use orphan kind of interchangeably with that. And then the last category is sojourners or foreigners. And so they are supposed to be treated with care. And this language is used, come, eat, and be filled, to talk about how people should treat these foreigners. So it's not just that they should feed them, like the minimal amount, but actually fill them till they're satisfied. And this is like a blessing on those foreigners. So sort of these immigrants or foreigners should come, eat, and be filled. They should be treated like they're not only part of the Israelites, but that they should be treated with great care and with abundance. And so when we get to Deuteronomy 23, our passage we're talking about, what we're seeing is actually not a picture of saying that no Moabites can be involved at all with Israel, because that doesn't even make sense of what happens in the rest of Deuteronomy. Instead, it's a particular phrase that's used. They are not allowed to come into the assembly of the Lord. So the assembly of the Lord isn't referring to the Israelite people. It's referring to ritual actions or like festivals that the people do. So anything that's a formal activity where they'd go into the tabernacle and worship God, that is the part that both Ammonites and Moabites aren't allowed to participate in. And also, they're not supposed to form, specific treaties with them. It's kind of the other piece, friendship treaties specifically. That doesn't mean that Moabites can't be among those foreigners who are cared for that are described in the earlier parts of Deuteronomy. It means that there's specific activities they can't take part in, while still getting to be part of with Israel as a foreigner. And so I think that distinction's important, because it means that in what we're seeing in Ruth, it's not changing what we've seen in Deuteronomy. But it is, I would say, expanding it. So we get this process in the Old Testament more broadly, and even into the New Testament, that God gives a command or an order or something in the law that then is explained or shown in new ways, in a new light, often expanded or opened up a little bit as we go through. So we get this kind of thing in the prophets, where they'll bring up something that was said in Deuteronomy or Leviticus, and then they'll engage with that and say, actually, here's what God meant by that, or here's what God is doing with that. An example would be Hosea talks about mercy over the law, or over like sacrifice, basically like doing ritual sacrifice. Micah does that as well. Talks about it's not the main sacrifice God wants is not necessarily bulls and oil, but a heart that is turned to God. And so I think that you, on the one hand, can see in Deuteronomy that's not inconsistent, and it wouldn't be inconsistent with what we see in the book of Ruth. On the other hand, I do think Ruth is pressing out a little bit the idea of what it means to include the foreigner. And so,
Yeah.
And I think like part of also how I personally have reconciled it is that Ruth at the beginning of chapter 1 makes it very clear to Naomi, and essentially to us as the reader, she's forsaken her loyalties to her people's gods, and essentially like your people will be my people, your God will be my God. That she's forsaken her own ethnic heritage, if we were going to say it in a modern way, and now has realigned her allegiances to the people of Israel and to the God of Israel. And so I think that itself presses against Deuteronomy 23 a bit of, almost though assuming, don't let the Ammonite and Moabite come in, especially if we're just assuming that they are still worshiping and loyal to their gods. But in this case, like,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do with a person who's now been convinced, ironically, maybe through Israel actually fulfilling their call of being a priest to all the nations, that
Yeah.
you have a woman here being an example of, I actually want to worship your God. Can I join? and and
Mm-hmm.
and
Mhm.
and so, like, in that case, like, so can we not consider you now an Israelite because now you are aligned with our people and with our God? Does that not make you ultimately, in the end, an Israelite because you are identifying with us as the people of God?
Well, and this whole
So
notion of who is Israel, right? And what makes Israel Israel? So is it their ethnicity? Is it their God? Is it their culture? And I think that question becomes a really key question really throughout the Old Testament. And the New Testament brings that up quite a few times too. Like what is Israel? And I think Paul answers that question in a really surprising way. You know, in some ways, but I think this idea that being aligned with God makes you part of the people of God is a really key part of what we're seeing in the book of Ruth. And I do think it forces us to ask questions about like the anti-Moabite sentiments that we get, not just in Deuteronomy. There are in the oracles against the nations, Moab is one of the ones that gets frequently mentioned, right? And so,
yeah.
is Ruth now a part of Israel in a way that separates her from her Moabite status? In what way and how much is a question that continues. But I think that's just a really good point.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Good thoughts, guys. Okay. All right. Let's hit this last one. This will be a fun one. So let's see y'all's thoughts on this one. I think this is a passage that a lot of people have had questions about for a while. And this question says, why does Naomi tell Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet? I heard that was a symbol for some sort of sketchy behavior. Does that mean that Ruth did something inappropriate or even worse with Boaz? So unpack the uncovering of feet and what do we need to know from this passage? What's actually happening?
So I'm going to start by saying that we don't know what's actually happening. So I'm going
Okay.
to start by just saying that there is great debate over what is actually happening because practice of uncovering someone's feet isn't something that we have a direct comparison to in other documents. So because of that, there's big questions. But the biggest questions have to do with how much sexual innuendo is in this passage. So
Mm-hmm.
some of it might seem a little obvious, like she lays down, he's in bed, she uncovers something, and then she's encouraged to stay. And then if people find out about it, it might be scandalous. So that in itself raises those questions. But when we look at the Hebrew and how it works, it even raises more questions. So there's a series of words and ideas that are all connected to sexuality. At night is a kind of basic one, like you're going to a man at night. That in itself has some potential suggestions. She goes to where he's lying down. So this word shekav can just mean that someone's lying down, but it also can have a sexual connotation of like lying down in order to have sex with someone. She comes in secretly, which is often translated like softly, but it's really like in secret, and like that's an emphasis. And then the word uncover, gala, has this idea of revealing something that's secret. So in places like Leviticus and Ezekiel, it's talking about uncovering nakedness. In places
Right.
like Deuteronomy, it's illicit sex acts. So now this can also be used in non-sexual situations like uncovering someone's eye or uncovering their head. But because you've got other words already that are lined up that have this sexual possible connotation, by the time you get here with this word uncover, it could be read either direction, whether sexually or not. And then the place of his feet is where she is supposed to go, and she's supposed to uncover his feet. So feet are just feet in some situations, right? This is the word that means feet. But this word feet is used as a euphemism for sexual organs for men and for women in other parts of the Bible. So for men, we see in Exodus 4, Judges 3, 1 Samuel 24, the word feet is used to reference the male sex organs. And in Deuteronomy and in Ezekiel, it's used to talk about female sex organs. So uncovering, using this word that can have this explicit idea with feet, which also can be a euphemism, creates a complexity in the passage. And all of this is done in secret and at night and in his bed, right? And then she lays down with him, again, using that same word that has the potential of lie down, just, laying down, or it could mean lay down in order to have sex. And then Boaz is startled to find her there because of where she is and what she's doing, but he encourages her to stay the night. And he hides what's happening. And then he uses his cloak to cover her, which is the imagery. And he talks about like spreading his wings over her. And this is a way that you designate that someone is your wife. So there's two possibilities for what we do with this passage. One is that the scene is about actual, like Ruth doing something actually sexual. That Boaz we don't hear Boaz returning that. We just don't know what happens. He just tells her to stay, but then we don't know what happens. So it's possible that what we're seeing are actual sex actions, but other places in the Old Testament, they have no problem just telling us that people had sex. So here, the language is intentionally unclear over and over and over again. So why create a tension around language that could be non-sexual but has sexual innuendo? Well, at least some scholars think that the purpose of the passage is to highlight that sexual tension, but that they aren't acting on the sexual tension, particularly Boaz not acting on the sexual tension that's present. And that actually shows something about the kind of person Boaz is. And also raises this notion of there is interest, there is excitement between the two of them, but if they're not acting on it, then what you're doing is creating a scene that feels like sexual temptation, but doesn't actually have sexual activity in it. And many scholars over the years have said that this is intended to show the righteousness of these figures in light of the sexual impulses they might have. So I think that's really interesting. Some scholars, Jewish scholars especially, will compare Boaz resisting this, comparing him to Joseph and Potiphar's wife, for example, in Genesis. So I think it's a very fascinating passage because it is possibly sketchy, but sketchy how, right? Actually probably more the case that if they were trying to say they had sex together, they would just say that. And if they had never not sexual, but it's intended to highlight sexual tension, this would be the way to do that. So that's my complicated response, but I think it's a very interesting passage because of it.
Yeah, those are good points.
I don't know why, but as you were talking, Beth, like I had like a flashback to an, I'm not going to say the TV show's name, but there was a show that was in the 80s and the early 90s where the main character was basically growing up in the 1960s and kind of highlighting about that tumultuous time. And there was one episode where he's in high school by that point, and he and his girlfriend, there was this pressure, this peer pressure of oh, you guys should do it, or however else we may say it today. And he tries without even asking her. But at the end, technically, the voiceover from the older version of the character says, and we slept together. But what the camera actually shows is that they both actually were exhausted just from watching a late night movie and fell asleep next to each other on the couch.
Yeah,
like it's like the most innocent and adorable thing to see, but he used the innuendo word of like we slept together, and yet they did not. Not in that sense, but in a very literal like dorky sense. And so it is kind of reminding me about this, that this is a little bit of like, that like all this is happening, and it's almost like it is creating this tension. I would be almost as if I was a listener expecting, okay, when are they going to do it?
Yeah.
When you're going to say it, right? They did it, right? And then the writer, the speaker, the storyteller, yeah, and that was pretty much it. They woke up, and then he made sure he didn't leave. That she didn't leave, and with other people seeing him, and he was completely embarrassed, and he was blushing. Like it was like that's it. Like, and
Yeah.
you're left as the audience wondering, like, wait, no, that can't be. No, that's ridiculous. But like, that's actually probably why it's true. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
that's
and
good.
I think it's so
it's funny because
interesting.
I do think there's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of like that kind of ink blot test of like what your own expectations are. You bring that into, in some sense, the story, and then when the story doesn't play out the way you expect it, you get upset.
Well, it's interesting because that's the thing about when scholars are reading it. The thing they say over and over again is we don't have a definitive explanation for what's happening here. So much is left up to interpretation. And it feels like an intentional choice to leave things in a way that is unclear. And it feels like maybe that there's a purpose in that itself. And it might not be a simple answer as like, yes, this happened, or no, this happened. That because in some ways you're right, it's an ink blot test. There's a certain amount that like one person will read it and go, well, clearly the Bible's just like avoiding saying what really happened. And then on the other hand, you have people who might be like, well, no, they're intentionally not saying what happened. So that also has a purpose.
That's good. Good. Okay. Awesome. Well, maybe this answer wasn't as spicy as we thought it was going to be, but it was still really good to actually be able to talk about this. I feel like this is always, as I've grown up reading this book, I've always wondered about this. It's just been a little question mark that lingers over this passage. And so I like the perspective that you shared. I think that's a really great insight. Okay. Any final thoughts, you guys, before we wrap up this episode?
I would encourage everyone to read these books.
Yes.
These are really,
Yes.
really valuable books. And some of them are short, but they're full of meaning, and it's taken, they're so essential to so much theology in different ways. So I just encourage people to take the time to read them and find meaning in them.
Good. That's great. Mike, any final thoughts from you?
I would say that like the Book of Ruth, it's a constant favorite because there is this interesting kind of reality about even the genealogy, the lineage of Jesus, of how folks want to say, oh, he was completely 100% Israelite, 100% Jewish, and yet his genealogical line shows like, no, there are moments where people who were not technically part of the people became part of the people, and that there is a hint of a hope of us as Gentile followers of Jesus, that we are just as authentically the people as Ruth was now authentically part of the people.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, thank you guys both for your wisdom and for taking the time to discuss through these questions. Let me leave you with one final fun question that we have. And the question is if you had to choose one book of the Bible to teach from for 1 year straight, you couldn't get off that book of the Bible, what would it be?
Probably Isaiah. I think one of the things about Isaiah is that you can teach the whole Bible by teaching Isaiah. You can talk about Genesis and Exodus. You can talk about the law. You can talk about kingship by talking about it. You can look at how Isaiah is connected to to the other prophets. You can connect it to the New Testament and who is Jesus. There's so many depictions of who Jesus is that come from Isaiah.
Yeah.
So much of the book of Revelation comes from Isaiah. So I actually think you could do a year-long teaching and really go, I'm going to talk about the whole Bible, but I'm going to use Isaiah as our starting point.
Good answer. I love that. That's awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for being with us for these past 2 episodes. And I want to encourage listeners that if you did not listen to her other podcast that she did with us on the 12 minor prophets, make sure you go and listen to those and be on the lookout for her. It's a commentary, right? That's coming out.
Yeah. Commentary on the Minor Prophets,
Okay.
volume 1 and 2. So
Yes.
it's on its way.
So make sure yes, be on the lookout for that. That's going to be a really great resource for you. And yes, so thank you so much for being with us.
It's great to be with you guys again.
Awesome. Well, everybody that is listening, thank you for joining us. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, leave us a review, and join us back here next month as we cover additional books of the Bible. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.